Good evening, and thank you all, or good morning, and thank you for all joining us as we welcome our fellow NGS member, Carol Bornstein. Carol is one of California's most highly respected native plant specialists. She learned a love of gardening from her mother, but it was taking a practical botany class while at university to study medicine that she realized her calling was plants and horticulture and transferred faculty. She's co-authored 2 books on California native plants. She was a horticulturalist at Santa Barbara Botanic Garden for 30 years. She is responsible for discovering and introducing several popular native plant cultivars and continues to champion the landscape value of native plants and the benefits of designing gardens in harmony with nature. Tonight, she will illustrate how, during her tenure as director at the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles County, the nature gardens there were transformed from asphalt parking lots and tired water-thirsty lawns into 3.5 acres of habitat for urban wildlife. She will highlight how visitors can now enjoy nature in an urban setting and how the museum scientists can now document the rich biodiversity found in the Los Angeles basin. Thank you so much, Carol, for joining us. We're so excited to have you with us and to hear your talk tonight. If you could share your screen, please.
There
you are.
Go. It should take a minute to load up.
Okay.
There we go.
There we are. I can see that now.
Okay, and I have to just do something else on my end.
Sure,
there
sure.
we go. Okay.
Great, thank you.
Got it.
You've got it.
All right, well, thank you, Angela, for inviting me to give this presentation. I was privileged to be a part of this quite remarkable project at the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles County. And just to clarify, I was the director of the gardens, not the director of the museum. It's a huge operation, and I was one small but fairly significant part of this venerable institution. So just for a little bit of context, the museum was founded in 1913. And when I came on board, they were wrapping up a multi-year transformation of several of the indoor exhibits and galleries that they had been embarking upon for a number of years. And during that process, at the same time, the city of Los Angeles was building a number of new metro rail lines to improve public transportation throughout the region. And one of them just so happened to run right in front of the north entrance to the museum. And this prompted the brainstorm, if you will, among several staff and some of the museum's consultants to take a serious look at the north side of the building and that public entrance, as well as the landscape surrounding the building, because all of a sudden they would have this new influx of visitors who were within steps of the museum through this public transit line. And that was scheduled to open right around the time that all these other galleries were being completed. So they embarked upon a very ambitious master planning process, bringing in consultants from architecture and landscape architecture to collaborate with the museum's scientists and educators and all departments within the museum, but the education team and several of their research scientists as well, to develop the concept and eventually the detailed plan for transforming what was mostly parking lots into these 3.5 acres that Angela mentioned in her introduction. And so here we go. I will walk you through how this happened and how the gardens are being used. And just to add to all of that, a reminder that the Los Angeles region has roughly, in the city of LA, roughly 4 million residents, and the greater metropolitan area is closer to 13 million. And on an annual basis, the museum receives roughly 1 million visitors. So they have a tremendous opportunity to impact the way people think about nature. So this introductory image here is from the lower level of the car park. And what you see is a group of visitors who are being led by the museum's ornithologist, who has discovered a hummingbird nest right there in the parking lot. He would walk the gardens every single day, surveying the birds around the grounds of the museum. And he was an amazing ornithologist and very wonderful educator. And so here you see a pair of baby Allen's hummingbirds nesting in a native barberry. So why does all of this matter? Primarily because Los Angeles is part of one of 36 biodiversity hotspots that occur around the world. If you can see from this map, all this green area, these are some of the several mountain ranges that define the Los Angeles basin, and almost all of the spaces in between have been modified, greatly, vastly modified by people. And this is where the bulk of these millions of people live. So what was formerly all native vegetation is pretty much restricted now to these mountain ranges, some of the foothills, and a little bit of the riparian corridors. This red dot signifies where the museum is in the midst of this Los Angeles basin. And as you can see from the text at the top, what a biodiversity hotspot is, possessing roughly 1,500 or more endemic vascular plant species, of which less than 30% remains intact. So highly compromised, very vulnerable biological regions where the rate of extinction is sadly very high. And just to look at it visually from a photograph, here is a view of that Los Angeles basin, and you can see it's a sea of development. There are a lot of green spots. You can tell there's a lot of trees in here, at least in some regions. Unfortunately, the vast majority of the planted landscape in Los Angeles is not California native plants. It's plants from other regions of the world. Some of them are climate appropriate, but a lot of them are not. They require copious amounts of water in order to survive and thrive. And a lot of those exotic plants provide little to no benefit for local wildlife, something that native plants that they co-evolved with are much better equipped to do. So that brought me, when I was working with the museum, to actually I was glad to stumble on this book that had recently been published by Douglas Tallamy, and several of you probably know it, Bringing Nature Home. And the whole thrust of that book was to emphasize the importance of planting at least some native plants in our gardens, because we have the power as individual gardeners to really make an incredible difference in what plants and animals survive going forward because of this increasing pressure on biodiversity in all regions of the world. His focus, as you can see from this quote, was on North America, but this applies globally. And so the museum, whose mission is to inspire wonder, discovery, and responsibility for its natural and cultural worlds, took on this challenge of using a brand new garden to make a difference and to help influence those 1 million visitors to think about ways that they themselves could possibly help to support preserving the biodiversity that remains. For some reason, well, there we go. So specifically, as part of the master planning process, the museum identified the things that they wanted this garden to be able to do for the museum scientists and for their visitors. Emphasizing habitat for wildlife was the overarching goal, to create habitat for wildlife in an urban setting. And to do that, they wanted to reflect both natural areas in the Los Angeles region as well as planted landscapes. because most people were not going to run home if they were responsive to this general idea of preserving biodiversity. They weren't going to go home and rip out all of their exotic plants and plant only natives. Not the most practical response. Some people would, but most people would not. So it needed to be an opportunity to show how you could maybe modify an existing landscape as well as make, perhaps incorporate more native plants. Emphasizing plants that are compatible with California and Los Angeles's Mediterranean climate in particular. In a normal year, of course, there's no normal. The Los Angeles area gets roughly 14 inches of rain a year. And like most of you from your Mediterranean regions, that rainfall arrives, in theory, in the fall and winter months. And then we have several months of very dry, practically zero precipitation during the summertime. The gardens were designed to be used by research scientists, both at the museum and from afar, to study urban nature. Of course, to provide ways for visitors to engage in some way, either on facilitated activities or independently, to make connections with nature. A very large percentage of Los Angeles residents have no outdoor garden space of their own, no green space whatsoever. And sadly, many of the schools in Los Angeles have precious little greenery as well. They are almost a sea of parking lots and land and asphalt. Fortunately, that has begun to change, but a lot of children just don't have a lot of opportunities to connect with nature, let alone play in outdoor spaces. And then the other goal, this last one here, a lot of visitors come to the museum intending to spend the entire day, but of course they need a break. And so the gardens were an opportunity for them to go outdoors, refresh, reflect, and just have some quiet time before maybe going back inside and looking at some of the other exhibits that they missed on their first go round. So here's just a snapshot of some of the many different educational programs that the museum developed. And I have not been there. And full disclosure, I left the museum in 2020, but I'm still in contact with a few of the staff there, particularly the horticulture team. And I know that they're still conducting pretty much all of these different programs to engage visitors in one way or another. And if you are not familiar with community science, that was a program that pretty much got launched at the same time as the gardens were under development. And the thrust of that was to help local residents, not necessarily citizens, because not everybody is a citizen. And some of you may know this, this type of programming as citizen science. So we intentionally use the word community. To help people who were interested in learning more about nature to develop the skills necessary so that they could participate in research projects, both with museum scientists and elsewhere, so that they could help them to do their work. And so those kinds of trainings were regularly and continue to be regularly conducted on the grounds of the museum. So to look at the garden project itself, the museum, as I said, worked with many consultants. The landscape architectural firm was Mia Lair and Associates, very highly regarded, based in Los Angeles, but involved in many other large-scale projects throughout the region and elsewhere around the country and world, for that matter. Their name today, they changed their name to Studio MLA. They were the landscape architects who helped develop the master plan, and then co-architects as the architectural firm that worked on the building itself, the new entrance. So the area in red is the footprint of those 3.5 acres, and as you can see, Angela, can you see my cursor moving around up here in the left?
Yes, I can.
Okay, so here's one large parking lot. Here's another large parking lot. This is the entrance that comes off of the sidewalk. And then this was the original building, the 1913 building, we call it, this Beaux-Arts building. You'll see a few glimpses of it. That was the first entrance to the museum over here. But the primary entrance actually is on the south side, and we wanted to more fully embrace this opportunity that I mentioned earlier with the new rail line, which runs off the page up at the top up here. So here was a first pass at a bubble diagram showing some of the potential different areas that could be created and re-envisioning this garden. And actually quite a few of these did end up being fully developed. And here is a more current colored example of the different sections of the garden. And I don't have the time to walk you through every single part of this. I'm going to focus on probably the more heavily utilized ones, but you can see from this aerial photo that there's a lot more greenery. Even the car park, which was redesigned using all of the asphalt and road base from the former parking lots to create this new one, which is 2-story. So they went underground to maximize, better utilize that space. And then all of this was, for the most part, replanted with the exception of a very few trees that were allowed to stay. So that was the former north entrance. Not very inviting. You can't even see where the front door is, and a fairly spare landscape. And that was transformed into this much more interesting, welcoming structure with this cantilevered bridge that was inspired by the anatomy of whales. And as you walk into that glass enclosed pavilion, you actually see the 60-foot long skeleton of a fin whale suspended from the ceiling. And then you walk directly into the museum and start your experience. On either side of that bridge and in the entrance plaza is the nature gardens itself. So a little bit of construction. You can see they're excavating for the car park here. And practically all of the land in this 3.5 acres was regraded to one degree or another to make space for these new gardens. The museum is world-renowned for its research on dinosaurs. And these are some of the iconic structures of the museum. They were positioned in another location before the project started. And they were moved to this corner so that for people who were taking the train, as soon as they got off the train, they saw this and could walk a few steps and come and explore the museum. So you walk along that public sidewalk, and here's the first pedestrian entrance. And as soon as you come through those gates, you're immediately, I think, transformed into this much more calming, quiet space. You've left this busy highway as well as the train. And by the way, across the street is the very large campus of the University of Southern California. So it's a very densely populated and visited part of the city, not too far from downtown Los Angeles. So these mature floss silk trees were, of course, they predate the project, but they make for a very majestic entrance, as well as for visitors who are arriving by cars. This is the ground level of the parking lot. And as soon as you get out of your car, whereas down below where we were seeing the hummingbirds, this is up above and you're at ground level with the entrance to the gardens. These are used to be Curvicea speciosa, now Ceiba speciosa in full bloom. Beautiful trees that were planted in the 1960s. When you go to the ticket booth to either get your map, show your membership card, or buy a ticket, there is this very large chalk sign that changes 4 times a year, drawing visitors' attention to some of the things that they might see or experience as they walk through the gardens. And those signs, as others that you will be soon seeing, were all designed and drawn by museum staff. The entrance plaza, is a very large space that was designed to be used for a lot of special events. It is a non-ticketed area, so if you're a student or a faculty across the street at the campus, the university, you could come over and just hang out over here without having to buy a ticket. The same applied to residents in the community. And it was also planted to create habitat for wildlife, as well as to be aesthetically beautiful and, for the most part, low water once established. So very colorful mixed borders line this entrance plaza. Some familiar plants. I don't have time to name everything, but I'm sure you recognize the Jerusalem sage in the foreground. A different Dusty Miller plant behind it, Centaurea, Gymnocarpa, Lantana in the back. On the other side of this entrance plaza is this massive sandstone raised planter. We call it the living wall. And it's a physical barrier to the ticketed part of the nature gardens, but it also is a habitat in and of itself, designed to emphasize plants and animals that occupy these niches, these narrow spaces. When you walk through the gated portal, and you've bought your ticket or you are a member, you're greeted by this chalk sign that explains what the nature gardens are all about, which Angela described in her introduction, and I'll embellish on as we go through here. But to setting the stage so people understand what these gardens are all about. And then there are these individual chalk signs that introduce each of the different garden vignettes. So here's one describing what I just mentioned about the wall itself, looking in the cracks and crevices to see what's growing there and what's taking up residence. So the emphasis is always on the wildlife, which was different for me, coming from a horticulture and botany background. The museum, the focus of most of its exhibits and research was about animal life. And so the connections between plants and animals was the emphasis here, but almost always through the lens of the animals and then what the plants were doing to support them, to provide and create that habitat. A beautiful image that Saxon Holt took a few years after the gardens were open of the wall as the vegetation has obviously filled in quite a bit. The Palo Verde trees on top of the wall, blooming exuberantly, Agave americanas, getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and quite a bit of vegetation spilling over from the top. So that it's basically a giant raised planter. A lot of large plantings in the top of the wall, but then smaller things growing in the crevices. And just a look at some of the things that do show up in the wall and did show up. These are paper wasps and their nest in one of the little cubby holes between the boulders. This is a western fence lizard. It used to be ubiquitous throughout the Los Angeles area, but because of development, very few of these are seen in the urban areas. Still quite common in the wildland areas around the city. And we were hoping that they would show up. The point of this garden was if you plant it, they will come. And only one animal, which I will show you later, was actually introduced into the gardens. And so, in fact, after I think the second year, visitors as well as staff started seeing occasional sightings of these western fence lizards, took photographs of them, documented them, and added them to the LA Nature Map that the museum was sponsoring. And again, this was totally in support of what lives here, taking stock of the biodiversity that remains in the core of Los Angeles. A number of Dudleyias, California succulents related to echeverias, were planted in these rock crevices. Even some of our native ferns, as you see here, dry-loving ferns. Several flowering plants. This is one of the hybrid monkey flowers that's native to California. And California fuchsia, which you probably have access to in some of your nurseries, I would hope. This is what used to be called Zauschneria, now is Epilobium. Beautiful coral-colored flowers in the summer and fall that are full of nectar that attracts hummingbirds. A closer look at some of the plants spilling over the top of the wall, rosemary in the foreground, and just behind it, a plant from the southwestern deserts. This is trailing indigo bush, Dahlia gregii, tiny little pea flowers. But what's great about this plant is that it blooms literally all year long and very dry loving. A really fantastic plant, which I'm sorry to say is really hard to get from nurseries. Also, some of our beautiful manzanitas that are highly speciated throughout California. Several of these were planted on top of the wall to also cascade over the boulders, and they bloom in the winter months. If you had headed in the other direction when you entered the nature gardens, you would have come across this mostly public space that we refer to as a strampatheater, which is kind of a mashup of stairs and ramps and an amphitheater all together. This was, I think, ingeniously designed by the landscape architect to make getting down to the lower level of the museum easily accessible to all of our visitors without having to encounter the steps. They're there if you want them, but you can also just meander along these different terraces to get to the bottom. Used for lots of special events, also for some of our workshops and classes. But as you could see here, people are just hanging out on a warm autumn day and having lunch and a snack and a break from being indoors. It's autumn because the grass is semi-dormant. The Chinese elm trees have dropped their leaves, and the sycamore off to the right is getting ready to do likewise. This is the one place in the nature gardens where there is a fair amount of turf grass, as you can see in these upper terraces here. But we used it as an opportunity to take some of these narrower beds to showcase some of the other more climate appropriate, low water use plants that you could use in place of water guzzling lawns, which are still far too common, not just in Los Angeles, but throughout California. One example is common yarrow. Here we allowed it to flower and eventually it will get cut back. The heart of the nature gardens is what we called the urban wilderness. This was a fairly big piece of real estate within the garden that resembles, probably more than any other place in the gardens, some of the natural areas that you would find around the perimeter of LA, the Santa Monica Mountains and the San Gabriel Mountains in particular, composed of mostly local native California species that you would find along the creek corridors, as well as in some of the upper drier regions of oak woodland. During construction, this is what it looked like. A few very large specimen tree box specimens were planted so that on opening day, the garden would have some sense of maturity, that it wouldn't just be a sea of tiny little plants. So what you see here are primarily coast live oaks and western sycamore. And we're standing on the bridge looking down. Notice that this is August 2011. Just less than a year later, we've started planting the understory, and the trees themselves are already beginning to grow. Things are filling in. And you can see here, this is part of that riparian or creek corridor. The landscape architects kind of used the Los Angeles River as a model of what this layout would be. Although the river is highly channelized, it reflects this particular interpretation reflects bringing water to the city, which is what has been done throughout much of California. We've transported water from Northern California to Southern California, dammed a lot of rivers, put in aqueducts and pipes and reservoirs to make water available year-round for our urban areas. And it terminates at this urban water feature, which actually is a really fun place for people to hang out during the summer. There's water sheeting over this pad right here that not only cools the air, but is a fun place for children as well as adults. Just take off their shoes and socks and splash around and have some fun when they're out in the garden. And as I said, all of the vegetation here are California natives, and even this little postage stamp lawn is a native sedge. So just a few years after planting, that is completely filled in. On an autumn scene, looking in the other direction, you can see this is that dry stream bed that does actually have water flowing through it during a good rain. And it terminates again at that water feature we just saw. The understory is composed of sedges and rushes and some ferns, and all of these plants do in fact need water year-round. They are not what people refer to as drought tolerant because their roots are in the water table. So even though you may not see the water in our local creeks, the table is high enough to support and sustain these plants year-round, unless we have a severe drought, which it looks like we're about to go into another drought cycle. You can walk through this urban wilderness on this beautiful boardwalk. Another early scene where we're still planting. Back here, there's several hundred plants getting ready to be set out. And then just a couple of years later, how it has filled in. So again, these are sycamores, alders, willows, and various associated understory shrubs and perennials. And it has become a much cooler place to explore. An example of some of the research work that the museum scientists are conducting out in the gardens. This is what's called a malaise trap, and it is a way to passively survey insects, flying insects. There's one side that is open. Insects will fly in there, and when they're ready to fly back out, their tendency is to go up. And so the only way to get out when they go up is through this little bottle here, and this bottle is filled with alcohol, and so of course the insects are going to die. It's all in the name of science, and what is done with these dead insects is they are brought into the museum in a public space in the nature lab, which is the indoor equivalent to the gardens, and visitors get to watch scientists sorting these insects so that they could figure out what has visited the garden. This is part of a region-wide research project called BioScan that the curator of entomology at the museum spearheaded. And the whole purpose of it is to document what the insect life is in the Los Angeles basin. And this was a completely novel, unprecedented study that had not been conducted anywhere else because we need to know what's here in order to determine densities, what is becoming increasingly rare, what's new, and hopefully identify eventually where some of these insects come from. And when I left the museum, between this trap here at the museum itself and dozens of others that they had placed around the region, they had discovered over 40 species that were new to science, which is pretty remarkable in an urban area. Just one example of some of the interpretive messages that are regularly being updated as things change in the gardens. Here, we lost an oak tree, the only mature tree that died under my watch, which we were very sad when it succumbed, but we took it as an opportunity to talk about the fact that dead vegetation also is habitat. Insects will burrow into the wood, as will fungi, and that in and of itself provides a food source for other animals up the food chain. And it's all part of the web of life cycle. Some more immediate examples of how the gardens were being used by wildlife. This is a fruit-laden branch of Toyon, or Heteromeles arbutifolia, one of California's most widespread and iconic native shrubs. And on the very same branch on the right, just a couple of weeks later, evidence that birds have been visiting the garden and eating all the berries. Cedar waxwings will come in flocks in the wintertime to devour. This is one of their favorite food sources. Lots of other berry-producing plants are in this part of the garden. Our native elderberry, our native hollyleaf cherry, even the berries of ribes. We had several species of ribes planted. Here you see the pink flowering currant in bloom, and the flowers are visited by hummingbirds. One of the understory plants that provides beautiful color as well as food are our native hybrid irises. Hopefully you can see right here where my cursor is, the rear end of a bumblebee diving into between the petals of this beautiful iris in search of pollen. There's our ornithologist again, Kimball Garrett, leading another group of people through the the urban wilderness. And here, obviously, they're looking up. I'm not sure what they're seeing, but they might be looking at this nest of a bush tit. These are birds that fly in flocks. They're very chatty and very cute, and they took up residence several times. We came across these intricate nests in the oak trees. This is a coast live oak tree, and the nest is made mostly of the dried flowers of the coast live oak. Another bird that we were thrilled to see show up in the urban wilderness is this poorwill. They are usually found only in wildland areas. Very rarely do they occur in urban places. Probably this bird was migrating through the city on its way to some other natural habitat. But because the gardens supported a lot of insect life, this bird decided to hang out for a little while because they are insect eaters. They fly at night in the evening and catch their prey. And here it was during the day, hunkered down, thinking that it was invisible among the leaf duff. A section of the garden that was intentionally designed to be a place for concentrated nature play was what we were calling the Get Dirty Zone. And here the stories that we told were all about soil, what it is and why we need to know a little bit more about what's going on underneath our feet, and give people an opportunity to interact with soil in several ways. There's the site of the future Get Dirty Zone right up next to the building, and here you get to see a view of the 1913 original wing to the building. Several raised planters were constructed here. The wooden one is out of recycled wood, and the other two that you see are built out of soil from the site. So these are called rammed earth. A little bit of concrete was mixed in with the soil and some colorant to illustrate different soil strata. And then they were filled with imported soil, and then eventually planted with, in this case, again, all California native plants. And you can see from this view that we are right across the main pathway from the urban wilderness, which is still not quite filled in yet. This is roughly early 2013. Very, just a month or so before the gardens actually opened to the public. So one of the things we incorporated into this zone were these compost bins. They were regularly taken care of by the garden's horticulture team, but an invitation to visitors to dig around in there with shovels that we had installed to look for earthworms and pillbugs and other small creatures that are helping to break down the organic matter. Just for fun, we contracted with a local artist to create these willow structures made entirely out of native willow branches. And right across the path in that urban wilderness, you could see living plants that produced this material. Children loved to go in there, run in and out, and actually they would pull pieces of twigs out of the structures, which over time became more and more dilapidated and had to be replaced. So we have built, during my tenure, 3 different willow structures, but it was all part of the nature play. We also set up a number of other building materials to encourage people to make their own structures. And in another region of the park where the museum sits, a large eucalyptus tree came down for reasons I'm not quite sure about, but we asked the arborist to cut them into these big sliced pieces and bury them in this sand pit and use it for, again, for more nature play. And notice in the very back, this screening wall here is made of that same willow material to hide some back of house areas that the gardeners use. Another very popular area in the garden is the pond. And this is the one place where we did introduce wildlife because the fish couldn't get there otherwise. There's actually an increasingly rare native fish that is found in the Los Angeles and San Gabriel rivers. Its name is arroyo chub. It's very small, little minnow-like fish that you can see right here. And the museum had to get a permit in order to introduced this fish into our pond. I know this is hard to see, but if you can maybe make out some of the shadows, we introduced roughly 25 of these fish, and very quickly they began to breed and reproduce and take up residence in our biologically dynamic pond. And here's a view of that pond made from the same sandstone boulders as the living wall here in the background, and planted with a wide array of California natives, those that you find actually in the water, like the cattail right here. There's some maidenhair fern underneath the waterfall, and then many other moisture-loving plants in the nooks and crannies of the planters that were created around the perimeter, and then the drier plateaus around the edges. So lots of wildlife opportunities to see and hear, quite a bit of bird activity, as well as insects. We worked with a local artisan to create this naturalistic fence for safety purposes. Number one, we wanted people to be safe because, the pond is very deep at its central location. It's over 4 feet deep. So we couldn't have people just gambling around on those boulders without supervision. And we also wanted the vegetation to be able to grow and the wildlife to have an opportunity to utilize this space. So a multi-purpose function for this perimeter. And it also serves as a place for vines to clamor. There's a clematis on the upper left and a native Dutchman's pipe in bloom on the lower right. A few of the other plants here, red twig dogwood in its late summer and fall dormancy, and native hibiscus has big, beautiful blossoms in the summertime, and its roots are actually in the pond. One of the things that this museum did at the very beginning of the construction was to start photo documenting the wildlife that was showing up by installing camera traps throughout the property. And here you see a Cooper's hawk cooling off on an 108-degree day in August. Some of the other creatures that regularly can be seen around the pond are several different species of dragonflies, just 2 of them illustrated here. They lay their eggs in the pond, and the nymph stage actually eats a lot of the vegetation in the pond, as well as it would eat some of the biology that's in there, some of the other forms of wildlife as well before they complete their life cycle. Other creatures that lay their eggs, these are the eggs of the morning cloak butterfly on the underside of one of the willow leaves surrounding the pond. As I mentioned, the pond is a really popular area with visitors, and school teachers have to make a reservation in order to get a spot to bring their students to get access into the gate, inside the gates, so that they can have fun sampling what's in the water. So you can see them dipping their ponds into the water, and then they're looking at what they've brought up with little hand microscopes, and learn about the ecology of water and how it sustains both the animal life as well as the plant life. And those are also facilitated by our museum educators. There are 2 different kinds of pollinator gardens in the nature gardens. One is up against that beautiful Beaux-Arts of 1913 building, and it was arranged intentionally by using the color wheel. It has these beautiful poured in place concrete walls to help define the beds, as well as clipped hedges, which in traditional gardens would probably have been, they would have used boxwood or myrtle, and instead we used a native shrub. This is a cultivar of coyote bush, Baccharis centennial. In the lower image, you can see that it's recently been pruned to give a formal edge, and up here a little bit more loose and natural. And this is one of the most popular plants with our entomology curator because of the tremendous number of insects that it supports. Here you see it in bloom. The gardeners would stop pruning it in the late summer to allow it to flower. And it's masses and masses of tiny female flowers that have a copious amount of pollen as well as nectar. And these are just two of the dozens of insects that were documented visiting these flowers. Quick look through the different color sections. Here's the orange area, one of the orange beds with aloes and alstromerias and anagoxanthus or kangaroo paws. A portion of the pink bed with Velthemia, South African bulb in the foreground, Grevillea from Australia in the middle, and that Ribes sanguineum glutinosum, the pink flowering currant in the background. So you can see we are mixing, we are blending native California species with other Mediterranean climate plants from around the world. Another plant in the pink section that is well represented is the California native hummingbird sage. And just a closer look at a mother hummingbird sitting on her eggs. In the purple area, two natives are Verbena lilacina. This lilac verbena from Baja California on the left, and on the right, a hybrid sage, the cultivar Allen Chickering. And just to reinforce that exotic non-native plants can provide habitat for wildlife, this beautiful swallowtail butterfly nectaring on Agapanthus. In the white section, again, a mix of natives and exotics. That's a white flowering redbud with a European honeybee, and then common yarrow and our native white sage in the background. Now, contrasting that more organized pollinator garden, right across the path is the pollinator meadow, and much more naturalistic in its composition. And that is composed entirely of California natives. An early image of the mix of colors and textures. And in the background, you can see through the canopy of that beautiful cork oak tree, Quercus suber, is part of the campus of the University of Southern California. So when this part of the garden was constructed, the earth was moved around to create these gentle berms, partly to ensure good drainage, but also once these were planted, that would help to mask some of the noise from Exposition Boulevard that you can see here in the background. There's the cars right there. And right behind that, those cars, is the metro rail line. Early plantings were primarily from containers. We put in a few modest-sized shrubs for height and structure. Those are Western redbuds, a few smaller scale shrubs, but the bulk of the plantings were perennial bunch grasses, herbaceous perennials, and eventually annuals. But before we could sow the seeds of the annuals, the gardeners had to address this burgeoning crop of weed seeds that had germinated. All of the gardens were installed by landscape contractors. And at the very end of the construction of the gardens, I had been given the green light to start hiring a team of horticulturists to take care of the garden. At one point, they were considering keeping on a landscape firm to manage these gardens. And I didn't have a difficult time convincing my supervisor that we really needed to have trained horticulturists brought on board to take care of these very sophisticated gardens. But before we were able to do that, this part of the garden was installed by the contractors, and they didn't do a very good job of making sure that the soil was free of weed seeds. And so that's what we had to, my first batch of gardeners had to take care of this when we were put in charge. So we grubbed out the seeds manually because we were maintaining the garden using organic practices. And then we were able to broadcast wildflower seed, as the head gardener, Richard Hayden, is doing right here. And that very first spring was an exuberant display of mostly the annuals, but also some of the herbaceous perennials beginning to bloom as well. And here's when the tidy tips, the genus Lea platyglossa, was in full bloom. A little bit too exuberant in some places because these annuals were growing so fast, they were overwhelming some of the slower growing bunch grasses. And we actually had to come in and pull physically remove some of these annual wildflowers so that we didn't lose the slower growing perennials. It was intentional to leave the dried and dead annuals when they were finished with their lifespan. The seeds were, of course, an important food source for birds, but also important to illustrate that California does have seasons and that there is inherent beauty in these drier phases. There's still a little bit of color from late flowering annuals and perennials, and of course the textures from the bunch grasses. But the dead flowers are an important part of the habitat value, which is what this sign is illustrating. And just another view of a quieter time with the cork oak in the background. Every year, the bunch grasses, almost all of the bunch grasses are cut back by the garden team, which is something that would happen in nature through either fire or animal browse. And that's to rejuvenate them and keep them full. And just within a matter of months, the scene changes to this much more colorful composition. A few of the plants in this part of the garden that were the stars. This is Palmer's mallow. That's a desert plant that blooms through many months of the year and attracts bees. Purple 3-on. This is that plant that's in my background photograph. This is a plant that's found only on the islands off the coast of Southern California. It's called Catalina silverlace. It looks like a giant yarrow. Blooms in the summertime. A beautiful grass also from the Channel Islands off the coast. This is Elemus Canyon Prince with that icy bluish color. Another desert species. This is apricot mallow that comes in various shades of orange as well as occasionally pink. And behind that, you can see some blue of one of our native ceanothus. Woolly blue curls, a super fragrant and beautiful native shrub that is highly attractive to hummingbirds. One of the bunch grasses that we planted that got a little bit too out of control. This is silver beard grass, and we had to remove quite a lot of this because it was taking up too much space. A bit of the wildlife that one could find in this part of the garden in particular are monarch butterflies, which you may know are highly threatened by extinction because of loss of habitat. They need milkweeds in order to complete their life cycle. This is one of our local species, narrowleaf milkweed. The monarchs will get nectar from the flowers, but they will also lay their eggs on these plants so that the caterpillars can, that's what the caterpillars rely on, is the foliage of milkweed. And then they eventually pupate into these beautiful green pupa to complete the life cycle. Another insect that looks actually like a hummingbird is this white-lined sphinx moth, here nectaring on one of our native penstemons. It also laid its eggs in the garden on clarkias, the annual wildflower, sometimes referred to as farewell to spring. And these are the big, fat, juicy caterpillars that emerge when the eggs hatch. So we had the full life cycle of this insect in our garden as well. Quite a few species of native bees visit the garden. There are over 500 species of bees that are native to Los Angeles County alone, which is something that was amazing to me. I had no idea we had that many bees in Los Angeles. And in the state of California, there are 1,600 species of native bees. Most people only know the European honeybee, which comes from your part of the world. And our native bees are mostly solitary. They are not colonial, and they build their nests either in cavities like you see here. This is just a very close-up look at one of the many holes that are perforating this bee hotel that we installed in the pollinator meadow, or they burrow into the ground. Here's physical evidence of the relationship between the insects and the plants. This is the chewed up leaf of a western redbud. And these semicircles here are what the leafcutter bees will do. And they take that foliage and they line their nests with it. And just a few examples again here of some of the different educational activities going on, not just in the pollinator garden, but throughout the museum. garden-led tours. This is our current head gardener talking about butterflies with a school group. Another one of our museum staff leading children on a nature walk where they can actually capture insects, see what they've found, and then release them. School groups documenting what they're seeing on these flowers in the pollinator meadow. And then for people who are on their own, walking around on their own, some of these visual prompts to encourage them to take notice of what they see and hear. And the last garden to share with you is the edible garden. This was designed to be habitat for wildlife, but also for people, and to illustrate the incredible diversity of plants that you can grow in gardens in the Los Angeles area. We rely on pollinators to pollinate a lot of these plants, and they, of course, have a food source themselves. Everything in this garden has an edible component for people as well. Even the beautiful herb border here, that's different kinds of thyme and lavender have an edible component to them. So as you can see, aesthetics were, a key part of the design of these gardens. Yeah, multifunctional. Very early view of the first planting of the raised beds. So the raised beds were intended for seasonal plantings of vegetables, and these were constructed also out of reclaimed wood. In the ground, off to the distance, is where the perennial plants were installed. Quite a diverse array of fruit trees and the herbs that you saw in that previous photograph. As things are growing in, looking a little bit more lush and exuberant. And we also incorporated these container gardens in the edible garden. These were actually designed by Mia's firm to illustrate that you don't need a huge space such as this garden illustrates in order to grow your own food. So providing that inspiration with this example, and then almost all of these different raised beds would have a chalk sign like this, explaining what the particular message is for that given display, which was constantly changing. Harvest tours are conducted on a weekly basis by one of the museum staff, inviting people to sample what we might have available at any given time. And if there was an opportunity for people to be invited into the beds to actually pick something themselves, we would let that happen, such as you see here. This family is harvesting blueberries. Again, examples of different ways that this particular garden is being used by visitors. Children planting vegetables, transplants, adults who are interested in learning how to garden, who had no prior experience, are getting their hands dirty, planting in this dedicated bed, and then during one of our special events, one of the many tabling exhibits. We had our problems, the horticulture team. All gardens have their challenges, and this little critter here was our #1 pest. This is the introduced eastern fox squirrel, holding on to, let's see, what does he have there? I don't remember what he's got in his mouth. It's probably a young, immature fruit of something off of one of the fruit trees. We would occasionally cover the fruit trees with bird netting to keep them out, and the blueberries likewise. But for the most part, we just had to sacrifice a lot of the produce to the squirrels. And they didn't restrict themselves just to the edible garden. They were everywhere in the nature gardens and pretty hard to eliminate. Another common pest is this giant grasshopper that would nibble on the foliage. But thankfully, a lot of the birds would eat them. And we were relying on, as the gardens reached some state of equilibrium, that the beneficial insects and the birds would help to keep the pest insects under control. Spiders, several different species of spiders are documented in the garden. They're excellent predators. Ladybird beetles would eat the aphids. Robber flies would actually catch other insects on the wing. Amazing looking creatures. And then bats. At least 5 species of native bats were documented with our bat detector. And they are insect eaters par excellence. And so they were helping to keep things in check. I mentioned earlier the Nature Lab, which is the indoor component to the nature gardens. It's right underneath that glass pavilion that you saw early on. And here is where visitors could have an opportunity to really dive more deeply into learning more about nature in the Los Angeles area. Quite a number of interactive exhibits. There are some live animals in here as well, taken care of by the live animal staff. But it was an opportunity to learn a little bit more about what people were experiencing as they walked through the nature gardens. And last but not least, just a shout out to the incredible team of horticulturists who worked on these gardens. There were, I think, 5 at the time that I was there, plus the head gardener. And they really had their hands full taking care of these very intensively planted and managed gardens using sustainable practices. They also were part of the education team. All of the gardeners had to go through our interpretive training because they were often the only person that a visitor might see, and we wanted them to be able to deliver information and messages in a meaningful, accessible way to our visitors. So that is a wrap. I'm happy to entertain questions if there's time. So thank you very much.
I think we would love to have probably some questions. Can I just compliment you on a beautiful slideshow, flowing commentary into this wonderfully inviting place, an educational place. I really want to go there, but short of
Please do.
we will, but short of flying there, I mean, I feel like I've really visited it, and it's an amazing achievement, I think.
It really is. It was a remarkable project. And of course, it was ever changing, as gardens are. We did have to make a lot of changes to the plant compositions.
Sure.
As you can imagine, starting with a pretty clean slate, not everything thrived in the first pass. We did have some problems with some contamination in some of the soils, and had to redo some of the compositions, but that's what gardening is all about. So.
Sure. So, Carol, can I ask you to take end your
Stop
share
sharing.
so that we come back to the gallery,
There we go.
everybody's speaking. And can I ask for any live questions if you raise your hand, or just maybe just in the interest of speed, just take a shout, come to speak up. I don't actually see the chat, so if there's any questions on the chat, Sean, would you be very happy to just read the chat quickly while anybody else wants to ask Carol anything? There's a lot of people thanking Carol, I see.
Let's see. Okay. Gophers. People asked about gophers. Did you have trouble with gophers, Karen?
No gophers. No gophers,
What?
Amazingly enough. It was the squirrels were really our most serious pest. And we couldn't trap them. We couldn't trap them. I mean, they were surrounding us. We're in the middle of what's, I didn't give you the context, but the museum is in Exposition Park. And there are several other museums on that property. And if we started trapping the squirrels, then squirrels from the adjacent properties would just move in because they're territorial. So, it was a battle we would never win.
Yeah.
But at least when I was there, no gophers.
Well, fingers crossed.
Yes.
Somebody asked about supplemental irrigation for the wildflower meadow.
All of the garden has an irrigation system, a pretty sophisticated system, I would say, and it was linked to weather satellites. We were constantly tweaking it and reprogramming it because any system is, not foolproof. it requires human intervention. But there
Yeah,
was
you can't
irrigation
go
in
on.
the wildflower meadow. That was one of the least irrigated areas in the garden. During the summer months, it would maybe get 1 or 2 soakings per month at the most.
Okay.
Yeah.
Any other question? I've got Nan. I can see you, Nan. So maybe Sean finishes and then we go to Nan Sternman.
Well, I see lots of
Compliments.
kudos for what a wonderful talk, and I also say I'm very impressed with how well you put it all together and how calmly you delivered your message. Very, very well done.
Thank you. Thank you. It's as I said, it was an amazing project and a real wonderful experience for me personally to be a part of that. I mean, I learned so much from the scientists in the museum who were regularly interacting with us as the gardens unfolded, and also from the landscape architecture firm, Michelle Sullivan in particular. She was the lead. She was on this project, and a very good plants woman herself. So it was quite an amazing collaboration. And it's still there and doing very well despite being, some setback during COVID when we had to limit access to our gardeners as well. We completely shut down to the public and they were not able to keep up. So they had a lot of catching up to do when the museum reopened. But...
Okay, let's go to Nan. Hi, good evening.
Well, hi. I just wanted to add to what Carol said. She's being quite modest. Having visited that garden, she's, coming from the back end, but from a visitor's perspective, it is an absolutely phenomenal space. The just being in it, you're in the middle of the most urban part of Los Angeles, and it is an oasis. The plants, the way it's put together, I mean, you really get a sense that you are somewhere else. We shot a segment of one of my episodes of A Growing Passion in that garden. I put the link into the chat in case anybody wants to watch it, but we focused on some of the education going on with children, especially in that pollinator meadow. I think part of the value of watching it is that you get to see you feel like you're there. I mean, you're like walking through. It's wonderful to see the still shots, but when you're seeing video of those plants and how they appear, it's a totally different experience and complementary to what Carol has presented. And I just encourage anybody who gets to Los Angeles to go visit.
Yeah, I mean, what was clear also from the slideshow was just how much interaction is going on in education, and that the majority of people we were looking at were very young, and so that is obviously, even the MGS itself, we're looking at, how are we going to get young people in here?
The museum is very good about reaching a wide array of audiences. I mean, the school program alone, 250,000 school kids come to the museum every year. They don't all get out into the garden, but a lot of them do. And with some of their special events and their festivals, they reach teenagers, young adults, college students, families. They're very, very, they've got really, really talented people on their staff who are excellent at addressing different audiences. So, and they all come out and use the gardens too, in one way or another.
Yeah, very, very, very clever design, very, very wonderful execution, and a very, very wonderful presentation. So I think I'm going to wrap it up there because I don't see anybody else with questions.
May I add one thing?
Yes, sure, Lucas.
Hey there.
Hi, Lucas.
Hi. I just want to recognize the value of leaving certain, dry stems and flowers not deadheading right away. And I liked the use of signs to explain that to people and show them that there is value in habitat to leave some of these plant structures throughout the seasons. I guess things like with the bunch grasses, eventually you get to the point where you might want to cut something back or maintain something for the health of the plant. And perhaps that's just a lifetime relationship that you learn to have with species, right?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, we didn't cut, I think I said that we cut them all back, but we didn't actually. We were selective about that. Some don't need to be cut back every year. And some benefit and just look better, you know, from an aesthetic standpoint. But when you do cut them back, you are potentially reducing some of your local insect population, because insects can bore holes into the dried flower stalks and lay their eggs in there for the next generation. So there, you know, gardening is a trade-off.
Right.
And we were always trying to balance the habitat with aesthetics.
Right.
And also
Yeah.
with a nod to fire, you know, even though the likelihood of a fire, it's a wildfire in the heart of the downtown region of Los Angeles is not very high. But since we are modeling a garden for our visitors, we also felt like we needed to do some management with that in mind.
Right.
Catherine,
Yeah.
Catherine Greenberg, hello. You've just raised your hand.
Carol, thank you so much. I was really impressed to see through your presentation and your photos how quickly the garden became relatively well established.
Yeah, we were amazed as well. And I don't think I said this, but maybe I did. When the gardens were when they started construction, which was late 2011, and we opened in the spring of 2013 to the public, officially opened on the museum's centennial. That was the height of the last big drought cycle. And we were completely dependent upon the irrigation system to get things established, because we had very, very little rain those first few years. So, but the rain, you know, we were I think we did a really good job on managing the irrigation system to ensure such good, you know, growth.
It really came through. And I wanted to ask you, since you've left that position, have you moved on to another project or another book project, or what are you currently?
I moved back to Santa Barbara.
Oh, terrific.
Yeah, just last year. And I am what I call semi-retired. I'm doing some consulting, working on a few projects up here, mostly private, but some public work as well, but nothing on a full-time basis.
Well, I'd love to see you if you're coming up to the Bay Area. Please be in touch.
I'm overdue for a visit.
Okay.
So, you know.
You have a home here in Lafayette with us anytime.
Thank you.
Okay, last question from Sarah Dunsterville. Hi, Sarah.
Hi. At the start of the presentation, you mentioned that you'd authored some books, and I wondered if maybe we could have these repeated so that I could take the references.
Oh,
Sarah, they're in the invite text. Okay, so
that's right. They're
Okay.
in my, yeah.
they're
in
in the invite to attend the talk. That's where they are.
Thank you very much.
Okay, great. Anyway, thank you, everybody. I'm hoping that we're going to Australia next month. Can't confirm quite yet, just nailing down. So it might be a bit of a different time, but as soon as I've got the full details, I will be in touch. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Carol.
Thank you.
It was wonderful. It was really, really enjoyable and educational. Thank you.
Thank
You're
you.
welcome. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody.